Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. George Saunders is an American great, a writer who continues to astound, evolve, and get deeper. His new book, Liberation Day, is his first collection of stories since his National Book Award finalist, 10th of December, was published 8 years ago. He has been called the best short story writer in English, a gentle giant in American letters, well on his way to becoming a 21st century Twain, and an author possessing otherworldly love. We have been celebrating the short story over the past several episodes, so it makes sense to conclude with one of the best. George Saunders' Liberation Day contains 9 stories that encompass joy and despair, oppression and revolution, bizarre fantasy, and brutal reality. Saunders is also the author of the bestsellers A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, Lincoln in the Bardo, and Congratulations, by the way. He teaches in the creative writing program at Syracuse University, and it is a great pleasure to welcome George Saunders back to the Book Show. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Joe. How are you? Thanks for having me back. Always
I'm
look forward to our conversations.
I am I'm well. I'm always happy to have you on the program, and it's a thrill. This is such an interesting and fascinating collection, and I look forward to talking to you about it. Give us a sense, before I get into specific questions about it, of at what point do you think, okay, we're ready for a collection?
Yeah, usually about three-quarters of the way through. Well, okay, I start off and I have a certain aesthetic approach that's interesting to me for some reason. About three-quarters of the way through, it starts to sort of not exactly wear out, but let's say come to fruition, one in this direction and one in that direction. So it's kind of a feeling that that aesthetic approach has kind of done its bit for me. And it's almost like you're like a doctor and you got an impatient patient in the next room waiting to get in, and that's the next book. So it's kind of a feeling of, I've been thinking of the short story this way for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, and now there's another way coming up. So let's get this one out the door, something like that.
That is fascinating because it feeds perfectly into my next question. If I'm a person who has, let's say, lived through the past 5 6 years and look at the world and wake up and think to myself fairly often that we're doomed, and then I read this book, well, it's not exactly going to change my mind on that, is it?
Well, that's a very lively question in my mind right now because I think it should be encouraging, and I'll make the case for it.
Okay.
I'm the son of a salesman, so I'm ready to go. But the stories are on their surface, they're not too cheerful. I mean, they're the world these characters in is pretty bleak and so on. But as I was working on them, what I felt was in every case, either the character or the narrator is working from a place of like confusion or delusion, or some kind of being manipulated, and he or she works their way through to something like truth. And it's not necessarily that that deposits them in a happier state of mind or a better situation. They are hopeful in the sense, well, one, if they're good, that's hopeful. If a work of art is good, that gives you some uplift. But second, just this idea that we can kind of come through the haze and we can come through difficulty on the other side if we don't despair, and two, don't give up on the idea that truth actually can exist for us. Something like that. And now
Well,
hopefully they're funny too. That's the other the
Well,
other
they
part.
are funny and they are beautifully written, and that's a great point to make. That with that does give you hope because the writing is so beautiful. Let's look at the first story. It's the title story, Liberation Day. Tell us a little bit about this because it's the longest story in the collection, and I would say it sort of sets that tone that I was referring to at the beginning of being somewhat bleak.
Yeah. Well, what I like to do to start a story is to have as few ideas as possible. Don't have any intention. I'm not trying to uplift or downlift. I'm really just trying to make some fun for myself. because if I don't have fun, then nothing surprising happens, and that's really the whole point. I think situation, kind of like Houdini, where you don't know how to get out of it, and then you figure out a way, and then the reader sort of shares in that journey with you. So on this one, I just had a kind of a desire to give myself permission to do some weird, over the top writing. I didn't know exactly what kind. So, and here's the kind of mysterious, freaky part: is I just thought of an earlier story of mine called the Semple Girl Diaries, where these women that we understand who have been from poor countries have been hung in the yard. The culture has changed, and this is understood to be okay. You hang these people in your yard. So in this story, it's just a slight twist in that there's wherein people can take other people into their homes, kind of mount them on the wall, and then because their brains have been altered, they're capable of making these beautiful, high level speeches. And there's also a second class of people who can sing. And the reason this is good is that you can actually program them yourself. So you can kind of do a form of fiction writing really by making these sort of multimedia presentations. So that's the weird part. Um, but with that, I knew I could have some fun with the voice. And so that's what it became, kind of a little crazy exploration of that world from the point of view of one of those poor guys who's hung on the wall.
And they're basically, I mean, one explanation would be they're puppets.
Yeah, I think they're human beings who have been converted into puppets, basically by And there's another story in the book where there's a premise of that at some point in the future we have the technology to basically take all the data out of a person's brain
Right.
and just render it back as an operating system. So that was done to them, quote unquote, improved to have these elaborate powers of speech.
What did you want that story ultimately to say about us? Are because are we the ones hanging on the wall?
Well, yes, and I think we're also the ones that hung us up there. That was for me I honestly, Joe, I never have a plan or a thematics in mind. I'm just really trying to get myself into a mess in a story. And the working assumption is if I get myself into a mess in such a way that you follow me and you're interested and sort of believe in the reality, then as the two of us work toward a solution, we're in deep connection. And so almost no matter if the story ends happily or sad, it doesn't really matter. If we've been connected through it, then we've done the essential, work of literature. So in this one, I really didn't have much of a plan, but I did feel throughout the story that my loyalties kept switching around. Guy on the wall. He's kind of weird because he likes it. He likes his job. He doesn't realize he's being manipulated. We should be against the person who hung him up there, but then he's kind of an artist and he's kind of a nice guy. So for me, the path of that story was to keep thinking who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and the story kept saying everybody, sort of flickering on and off of virtue. And then in the end, he kind of a lot of his dreams get disrupted. But I think in the end, he's in a place I'd rather be in than the place he was in at the beginning. He at least sees what's happening.
The
And also
idea,
there's Custer.
yeah. Well, that's the other thing is we have Custer, and that is a story that is being reenacted here as well, which obviously, given that story, tells us a lot where these two rivers start to meet together.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I really feel, as I'm getting older, I think one of the purposes of art, and especially, literature or sort of like, higher art, is actually just to remind us for a second that the world is bigger than we habitually think about it. That there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio. So I kind of love starting stories in really crazy places and just letting them run off on their own energy. And my hope at the end is that the reader is just kind of like when you get off a roller coaster, you're not analyzing and you're not really sure what that meant, but you're in a different place than you were when you started. And I think that, in itself is, if you go through something like that, you've had a little moment of ritual. Oh, I don't really
Mm.
know what's happening in this world. That I think is a pretty powerful thing that we don't talk about very often, but maybe especially in times like these, to just be reminded that we can't have all the answers, and we actually don't have to, is sort of maybe, an empowering thing.
Liberation Day is the name of the new collection of stories from George Saunders. It is out from Random House. As a broadcaster, I go through life thinking of things when I'm talking that I'm on mic or off mic and that kind of thing. And I was listening to the first story in the audio collection, which you read the first story. You have a wonderful
Mhm.
group of people who read the story. And I'm listening to it, and I, for whatever reason, thought that you were saying adult on mic. And I am
Oh.
thinking to myself, like it's something out of Get Smart. It's like chaos, that there's this group of an adult who's on the mic. Well, then I go to read it.
Oh, yeah.
Then I go to read it, and it's adult son mic, and then I feel like an idiot.
No. You're just the victim of my Chicago slurry diction. Adult son Mike. I have to practice that.
Adult
Adult son Mike.
adult son mic. And then, although
But I like that.
well, that's it.
It sounds like a club
it worked both ways, really, I have to say.
Well, it sounds like it's a club you should start, Joe. Adults on mic. And you and all the other hosts can get together and commiserate.
Get together and
But if somebody's immature on mic, they're not allowed in because those are kids on mic.
yeah, no, that's much different. When you finish a story like that, especially at the length of that story, and as you said a moment ago, that you don't necessarily know where you're going, and I assume that means by length as well, that you don't know whether that's going to be 5 pages, 10 pages, or 30 pages.
Right. There's a feeling, I don't know, my aesthetics sense is that when a story stops escalating, you should quit. Escalation kind of means like when it's answered the questions that it asked, then you're done. So in this one, I mean, I think the question hanging over it is, can this poor guy, Jeremy, ever see past the veil that they put him behind? Can he ever understand who he actually is? So at about page 60 or whatever, we just get to the point where he's about to start looking into that, I think. And I'd written past that point, and it all seemed a little bit kind of PS-y, like, yeah. There's one model of the story that says there's the overstory, which is the stuff that the events and the kind of basic questions. And then there's an understory, which is what the story is really about.
Mm.
And as a writer, you don't actually know that. You can feel it sometimes, and you're trying to coax it to the surface. And in this one, the understory felt to me like that question: is he going to wake up or not? So once you've hinted that he is, I think it's sort of elegant to just get out. I could have described the next 4 or 5 days or something, but there's something in the form that wants that kind of, yeah, I would say elegance, if possible.
There is a story in the collection which I really love called A Love Letter. It's a letter from a grandfather to their grandson. There is a date, but it's not complete. We don't know exactly. It's somewhere in 20-something, 2020-something. And there are initials of G, M, J. And the ultimate idea here is that they're being somewhat cautious in the telling of the story. Give us a sense of what brought you to that point, because it seems to me that what is happening here could be interpreted in different ways, which I assume was ultimately your intention.
Yeah, I mean, I just was trying to imagine our country in some number of years from now, at a time when this sort of current drift towards the autocratic was complete, and it was kind of too late to pull democracy out of the garbage can. And so we have a grandfather who's lived through this and has some regrets about it, and he's writing a kind of affectionate letter to a grandson. And we get the sense that the grandson has sort of maybe lightly accused the grandfather of not having done enough during this period. So that kind of just came out of a couple conversations I had with family members who were both to the left and the right of me, and kind of that feeling that if you talk about politics right, and I think of it as Chicago style, where you can be as rough as you want, but you always keep loving the person. If you do that, then it's actually a kind of a form of connection and even citizenship. So my thought is that he's going to try to talk this out, his guilt and his regrets, but also his new feelings with this kid that he loves. And what I discovered was I don't, when you're writing a piece, hoping to do is use your experience, but in the rewriting, the character becomes less you and more of himself. So in this case, this grandfather is a little more cautious than I hope I would be in such a situation, but we don't entirely disagree with him. He makes a good case. Someone might have advised their grandson during the Stalinist purges, keeping one's head down isn't necessarily bad counsel. Yeah, and there's also just the motivation of feeling a strong sense of sadness about what's happening now and wanting to put it down on the page.
There is a story in the collection called "The Mom of Bold Action," who is a writer and seems to see tales in just about everything. Do you feel that way? I mean, does that come from a personal experience of sort of playing with things of what can be an introduction?
Yes, but more so when I was first starting out because she makes the kind of familiar beginning writer error, which is she tries to vet a story before she writes it. So she has an idea and she plays it out in her
Mm.
mind. And in her case, she mostly abandons them. But if I were her teacher, I'd say, well, put down a couple lines and see how it goes. But she's has that very, to me, familiar and lovable writerly complex, which says, I don't want to start it unless I'm sure it can be sure it's a story, pretty much a recipe for disaster. And so for her, it means there's a lot of wild imaginings, which she then discounts. But meanwhile, the page is still blank.
That's fascinating, though, that idea that because when you think of it on the surface, you're like, oh well, thinking it through isn't a bad idea. But
Except at least for me in art, it is because there's that quality of like if I already know where the story's going, and I say, "Hey, Joe, sit down. I'm going to tell you a story." There's a kind of a condescension in that. I don't actually care if you're interested or not. I've already got it written in my head. Whereas the more dynamic process is, Joe, sit down. I'm going to start right now telling a story, and you're going to kind of be involved in it with me. So when you're rewriting a story, yet that I'm kind of imagining you in my mind. Is he still with me? What are his doubts? Where is he resisting? I think her issue is that she kind of isn't really thinking it. She's only looking for the instant validation of knowing that if she writes a story, it'll get her somewhere, you know. And then the irony is in the story, she does write something
hmm,
that has some power, and it does get her somewhere, but it's kind of not where she not where she wanted to go.
have you ever felt that way?
Yeah, only not too often, but one time I had a story called Winky. It was in the New Yorker years ago, and
Mm.
in the story, there's this guy who's at a self-help seminar, and he gets very moved by this self-help seminar that he should be more selfish and more, uh, you know, do things on his own behalf. So he's got a sister at home who is kind of a little bit borderline mentally ill, and he decides that for his career, he needs to move her into a group home or something. And so I get an email from a guy, and he says, "Really loved your story. It really helped me in the way that literature can. Um, because of it, I decided to move my mother, who's 69 and in pretty good health, but she's a lot of work for me. I'm moving her to the group home."
Oh
And I
dear.
frantically wrote the guy back. I said, "This, that, no, no, you're totally misreading the story." And I gave him I gave him a 3-page analysis. And he wrote me this email, "No worries, all done."
Oh
so,
dear.
so, so I think of that whenever I get up on the podium and start talking about the value of literature. You have to be a little careful.
We've been exploring short stories on the program for the last few weeks, and I'm interested in your thoughts on kind of the state of the short story right now. It's a gorgeous form that really continues to flourish.
I think so. We teach it in the MFA programs. American writers and readers are, I would say, kind of hip to the short story in a way that other readers and writers in other countries aren't. It's kind of a form that many of us come across it in college, and then if we go on to study writing at the master's level, we're mostly studying short stories in that workshop format, and I think they're beautifully adaptable. people can come to the form and change the form by making it their own. It's very receptive to what a person brings to it, I would say. And actually, nobody knows what a story does, as I'm sure you saw in your last few programs. They're really they're almost like a song. A song. What's a song? Well, it's Gershwin, it's Beyonce, it's Wilco, it's really anything a person needs a song to be, it can be. And then finally, I think that in our time, a collection can be full of not only different voices and different experiences, but whole different worlds can appear in a book. And then you let those worlds sit beside one another, and that feels like our actual world to me.
You were talking a few moments ago about you said, and I hope it's funny, the humor that is so evident in this collection is so evident throughout your work is so beautiful. I'm interested in how you tune that to have in a story as you're working through it to have, if you will, the joke land.
Right. That for me, that's a one-word answer, which is revision. So the trick for me is to be able to come back to the thing and read it again and again, somewhat, I guess, accurately. I mean, when you read something, a lot of times it goes a bit dead in your mind, and or you grow fond of things, and so you don't want to cut them. So I think the skill set is on draft 80. So now it's not like you're laughing every time, because that would be weird. But you're kind of you sort of have a vestigial memory of having laughed, at age 8. So that joke gets a sort of an automatic in, but it really is just reading it many times and altering it. And then I think for humor is a story to be honest within itself. So if you make a certain moment, the humor for me somehow, mm, it, jokes like that, they often come out of a moment of awareness that you're reading along and you realize there's a little hidden joke right there, and you unearth it. That tells the reader that even in that draft you're still alert to it. You're not phoning anything in. So I really love it. I just think it's humor is kind of a form of a quick honesty. Like if somebody farts in an elevator, and there's only two people in the elevator, everybody knows who did it. So if the person who did it sort of goes, "Whoa," you know, th- he's just acknowledged reality in a way that sort of, I don't know if you'd say it connects him to the other person, but but it could.
Yeah, absolutely. You have mentioned the reader many times in our conversation. In spending my time talking to writers, a lot of times you hear how much that a writer will talk about trying not to think of the reader, and that
Yeah,
they're writing for themselves. They're writing what they want to say. They can't have that reader in mind, but that
right.
reader seems ever present for you.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's actually not thinking of a particular reader, really. I'm reading it as if I'm reading it for the first time. So, but what that really means ultimately is I'm assuming that that person, that is me reading it as if I hadn't read it, is identical to or has a lot of resemblance to somebody out on the street. In other words, I'm thinking if this makes me laugh, it's going to make quote unquote the reader laugh. So that's in a sense the fundamental tenet of fiction is that if I feel something over here and I work to get it in prose, you're going to feel it on the other end. And of course, it's not precise. There are some people who just don't like my book that's or can't get through it. But that assumption, that if I throw a pond in the water, the ripples go across to you. That's a real deep one. It means that we're on a continuum. It means that we're not lost. We're not alone. So I think every writer comes at that from a different direction. But for me to think of a reader as somebody I really want to impress and I really respect, who's lived as much as I have, and so on, that gives me a way to revise. Basically, I want to please that imaginary presence.
Which is different from the W.H. Auden quote and idea that having multiple readers in mind and trying to keep them all in mind at once.
I wonder because in a sense, I think what I'm saying is if it moves me and if it's deep enough, that's the thing I think, Joe. If it's deep enough, then I'm saying that some eternal part of me is talking to some eternal part of each of those multiple readers. That's the assumption. I don't know if it's actually true, but I think the reader feels the intention. You know, I've been reading Marlon James, who I just adore, and when I'm reading his books, I feel him on the other side, honoring me with his attention. So I think writers come to this by different paths. But for me, I guess sort of as a South Side of Chicago kind of former smart aleck, I'm trying to do that by going as far as possible in the direction of this assumption that we, in our best parts, we're the same, something like that.
I find it disappointing that you consider yourself a former smart aleck.
I'm an evolving smart aleck.
I mean, we should all be a little bit of a smart aleck, right?
Oh, for sure, 100%.
Willing to speak the truth and to have that idea of a little impishness of saying, oh, okay, well, let's see what we can do with this.
I love that word too, impishness. If I make a kind of any kind of joke, I'm trusting that you'll receive it, which is again a form of sort of relaxing the environment a little bit and saying, yeah, this is a tough world down here, and nobody can get it perfect. So let's all kind of lean into the wind together a little bit.
The new collection is Liberation Day Stories by George Saunders. It is published by Random House. George, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I thank you so much for being with us this week.
Always a pleasure for me, Joe, and thank you for what you do.
George Saunders' new collection of stories is Liberation Day. It is published by Random House. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.